Thought experiment. Imagine you're in your 20s and you're engaged to be married. And you bring your fiance home for the first time to meet your family. You might have lived out of town or military, something like that. But it's an interracial relationship. Okay? Here's the question. From what other racial group could your fiance come for whom your family would be the most accepting, the most supportive, the most encouraging? They say something, well, like, not one of us, but you did all right. Okay? And I need you to think about specific family members, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, specific family members, and think about why. Why would they be most encouraging or supportive of somebody from that particular racial group? You got to get to the why. Give specific reasons, specific rationale. What would they say? Got it? Think about some reasons. All right, now let's flip it. From what other racial group could your fiance come for whom your family would be the least accepting, have the most issues, the most pushback? Say something like, well, not one of us, and you may want to think this over. I don't know. All right? Be honest. Okay? Think about specific family members and think about why. Why would they be most uncomfortable with somebody from that particular racial group? Got it? Okay. Now, the science suggests that most of you could do that pretty quickly. It might have been a bit uncomfortable, but you can probably do it pretty quickly. Right? Why? You did not grow up in a vacuum. You grew up around your family, friends, community, people you know and love, and they had biases and stereotypes and prejudices, and you've been exposed to them. Some of y'all bought into them. Some of y'all pushed back. I don't know, but you have been exposed. And those racial attitudes at the extreme levels, racism or extreme racial bias, has existed for hundreds of years, particularly in the U.S. So I am Reverend Dr. Brian T. Marks Sr., founder and chief equity officer of the National Training Institute on Race and Equity, tenured professor of psychology at Morehouse College. And today we're starting our series on looking at the causes of bias, implicit and explicit. We're titling the series, actually, let me go ahead and put this up so you can see this here. Okay, let's go over here. There we go. So why are a Break Your Bias series? Why are all, scratch that, most, scratch that, many, scratch that, some people racist? Okay. And today we're going to address what is race and racism. Okay, so part of why we do these, we have this YouTube channel, we have this content, is to complement what we provide in our implicit bias trainings, our DEI trainings with companies and governments and all sorts of things. I often run out of time, and so the channel is a nice supplement. I can slow down, break down some pieces that I'm not able to cover in our trainings. So we offer trainings virtually and in person, and we also host 3, 4, and 5 day retreats in Atlanta on site. Pretty cool. Okay, so let's dig in here. We're going to address this question in a variety of ways with some historical pieces. And let me just say that to my colleagues, my anthropologists and sociologists and historians. All right, so I'm giving summaries here. So give me a little bit of grace, a little bit of wiggle room on some aspects of what I present. All right, so let's go ahead and push forward, folks. So what is race? All right, we see it as a form of social grouping. You've heard a social construct, a form of social grouping in which observable physical characteristics that distinguish a group of people are linked to a range of other non-visible, but also assumed to be genetically determined characteristics. For example, intelligence. All right, so race, folks, let's back up. In the human race, all over the world, people differ in terms of physical traits and characteristics, skin color, eye color, hair color, that sort of thing. We could all acknowledge that people differ physically. That's fine. What happens, however, over time is that societies begin to associate certain traits, positive or negative traits, with people having different combinations of physical features. Noticing difference is fine. Adding value to certain characteristics versus others is where things get a little tricky. Okay, so I'm going to give you the background and context of race. I understand it as a social construct. Social means people. There's something we made up. We want to categorize things. So we can categorize people, but then we added traits and characteristics with valence, with positive or negativity to those traits. Another key aspect of these traits, as mentioned, key physical characteristics are skin color, eye color, and hair color or texture. So essentially, when you see another human being, in a U.S. context, right? Your brain, sometimes consciously or not, is categorizing them into racial groups. right? I want you to break your bias, slow down your thinking, and process what are the characteristics of this person that equals black or white or Asian or Hispanic or Middle Eastern, whatever the case is. Often for many of you, skin color, eye color, hair color play a prominent role, along with some other things. But you're looking at the features, you're running some sort of calculus, and you're concluding this particular racial group. Now, we'll talk later, actually in another video, about how difficult that can be, the notion of race and ethnicity and how they overlap and, what skin tone makes somebody black or white or whatever. We'll get to that a bit later. But for now, this is going to be our working definition, okay? It is a social construct based on physical characteristics driven by skin color, eye color, and hair color. Now, let's look at some historical background, quick history. Up to the 1600s, race as a term referred to any group of people with common characteristics. Okay, let me pull myself over here. There we go. Any group of people sharing common characteristics. Usually they were non-physical characteristics. One's occupation, region, social status, what we today call ethnic groups. So, and this was even in Europe, amongst white Europeans, the term race was used, but it referred to people in different households. Even you have a big household, a certain land, certain area, certain occupation. The term, that race of people, was still used. Okay. Now, also what was going on at this time, simultaneously, 15, 16, 1700s, several European countries wanted to obtain resources from other parts of the world. That's important. Think big business. In each country, as a company, folks, this is going to help you. As I describe what's going on today, in this video, as I describe what's going on, if you reflect on these countries, really 5 main countries I'm going to talk about as corporations, as companies, right? So these countries in Europe, they have some resources, but they're somewhat limited. They want to expand and obtain more resources to make more money to enrich their country. So when we talk about these countries, typically we talk about the ruling class, the royal class, the ruling class, noblemen, merchants, that sort of thing. Not every citizen in each of these countries, right? But these are the ruling and elite class who are driven by a profit motive to obtain more resources. If you think about this as big business, it is going to help you, okay? So this is what we call the European transatlantic slave trade. Okay, the way to look at this, Africa over here. And so this is just giving you a sense of the numbers and the thickness of the line or the arrow gives you a sense of how many, but then relative to each other. So the numbers of slaves from West Africa, for the most part, West Africa, a little bit from over here, but West Africa taken to North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Okay, so this gives you a sense over time. So we're talking, late 1500s, 1619 is the key market for the U.S., but late 1500s, all the way up into the 1800s to varying degrees, depending on the country, when they banned importing slaves. Okay, importing black people who were enslaved, I should say. Okay, so some quick things we need to appreciate. Okay, now 1700s. Europeans focused on physical characteristics during the transatlantic slave trade, mainly again skin color, but also eye and hair color. Okay, why was that? Well, the dark skin of Africans made them easy for Europeans to identify. So if you're in the U.S., Northern, Central, Southern America, and you have white immigrants, right, who may be of the upper class, and white immigrants who may be indentured servants. After one generation, accent is gone. There's a local accent. White folks could blend in with the other white American groups, let's take the U.S. context, could blend in after one generation. So effectively, you couldn't identify them visually. It would be harder. And, many Europeans, white Europeans, were not comfortable enslaving their countrymen en masse, right? A lot of these are Christian nations. They say, oh, they're fellow Christians, can't do that. So it just didn't work for a variety of reasons. Okay? Now, also, Native Americans, indigenous populations were already there, right? This was their land, Northern, Central, Southern America, Caribbean, already there. But trying to enslave them was tricky for a different reason. They were there, they knew the land. So I'm trying to enslave you for labor, and but the land, you could just easily escape. Didn't work out as well, okay? All right, so the way to think about, going back to big business, what do you need to run a business? Material resources and human resources. If you think about those two, that's going to help you. Material and human. So today you're starting a business. What do you need to start your business? Office space, computer, software, printer, paper. But you need physical resources in order to run your business. And you need human resources, employees. I mean, you could do these things by yourself, but at a certain point, as you scale, you're going to need employees, human resources, right? So we can understand today you're starting a business, material and human resources. Back in the day, 14, 15, 1600s, the times we're talking about, the physical resources oftentimes were valued at the land level. Land was incredibly important. You still had the human resource, that was labor, but land was incredibly important. Why? Land, you have lumber, gold, silver, diamonds, those sorts of things came out of the land. So land, material, land and labor, incredibly important. You think about it that way, it's going to help, right? So Europeans wanted resources. They discover a whole Western hemisphere with a whole bunch of resources here, right? Ooh, all right, so they came over here, there's a lot of resources, we want it all, right? Now, but who's gonna work the land? They don't have enough people, right? So they say, well, European indigent servants didn't really work out. Indigenous people didn't really work out. Africans, for the west coast of Africa, already knew how to work in tropical climates, hot climates, right? South, it was pretty similar in terms of climate. And they were easy to identify visually, so they couldn't blend in with white people, right? There was a huge supply of them, right? So you're talking the whole West Coast, and yes, African kingdoms and kings and queens sold black folks into slavery. Yes, they didn't understand it was the chattel slavery version of slavery, but nonetheless, that did happen. So there was a significant supply over here, right? And it was difficult to escape in a foreign land. So if I'm an African brought to the Western Hemisphere, I don't know these lands. Native Americans could escape. They knew the land. I'm in a foreign land. I don't know. So that option wasn't there in the same way. Okay. So for very practical reasons, enslaving Africans worked on several levels. Okay. Then also over time, negative traits, including chattel. Chattel means property, were then associated with black people due to their enslaved status, and positive traits with white people given their dominant status. So you're in the Western Hemisphere, white folks are the ruling class, they're the slave owners, black Africans are enslaved, and over time, negative traits with the lowest sort of strata, lowest level of society, and more positive traits with the higher levels of society. Makes sense. Then, by way of advanced weapons and war, European countries expanded their dominance throughout the world to the point of colonizing, controlling, or influence over 90% of non-European countries populated by people of color, right? So folks, people often ask, well, how was it that, folks from England and France and Spain and Portugal and Netherlands could come to a whole hemisphere and dominate as they did? Advanced weaponry. Question. Who invented the gun? What country? China. Although China invented the gun, Europe perfected it. They had advanced weaponry and advanced tactics. And so due to those advanced weaponry and tactics, they can go to different places, a small subset of them, and dominate mass amounts of people. Now, we also know they brought disease with them to the Western Hemisphere that, killed millions of indigenous people who did not have immunity to some of those smallpox in particular in terms of those diseases. But when we look at here, let's look at countries that have been under European control, over 90%, historically speaking. So Europe, that's in purple. So that's your purple over here. Those in green here, the darker green, colonized by or controlled by Europe. So that's this Western Hemisphere, Africa, as you can see. This color, partial European control or influence. So these colors here, as you can see. Yellow, European sphere of influence, right? So the yellow over here. And then never colonized by Europe. Okay, a little bit there, a little bit there. Okay, you see what I mean? Folks, take out the emotion. In the history of the world, what other continent or region of people have dominated the world to this extent? Meaning, has there ever been a map like this where you had black Africans, people from Africa, dominating the world to the same extent? Have you ever seen a map like this? We have people from an Asian country dominating the world like this. Do you see what I mean? From Australia, indigenous people, right? The only time in human history global domination has happened to this extent and continues to happen to varying degrees was under European expansion. Those are just facts. Folks, I'm not talking about every white person, but I'm describing what happened in terms of European expansion. Folks, why do you think? Think about this. Western Hemisphere, Northern, Central, Southern America, Caribbean. What language do we speak here? English, Spanish, Portuguese, French. Why is that? Those languages are not indigenous to this land. They don't speak these countries. They came from a subset, a little itty bitty subset of countries, and they dominate. I'm talking about England. The state of Georgia is bigger than England. Like France is smaller than Texas. Spain is like California, a little bit of Oregon. What do we got here? Portugal is like, I don't know, it's like New Jersey, right? West Virginia, these places are small, right? Netherlands, even smaller, right? So the notion is these are itty bitty countries who dominated the world to varying degrees, okay? So once we understand that, again, take the emotion out of it. Once you understand what happened factually, think big business. Think about it. If I'm business called Spain or business called France, I'm trying to get all the resources. So there was a mad dash for this Western Hemisphere to dominate as much as possible, which from a business perspective makes perfect sense. The notion is at what cost? Let's keep on pushing, right? Now, eventually, European culture, language, religion, values, right, and physical characteristics like lighter skin and eyes became the standard or ideal in many non-European countries. So you have other countries that were non-European, but were under European influence that took on the values of European culture, right? Language, religion, food, all types of things. Okay. In the U.S., negative traits became associated with 1, black people, including chattel property, due to their enslaved status, and 2, Native Americans perceived as uncivilized. Positive traits were then associated with white people, given their ownership or dominant status. Folks, not too hard to get, okay? Just reiterating. Also, certain European immigrants to the U.S. were also the targets of bias. We acknowledge that, but eventually blended into white American society, right? So here's what happened. All right, homework. Look into when European ethnic white folks came to the East Coast, Northeast, Boston, New York City, that sort of thing, around the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? When the Irish came, when the Polish came, when the Italians came, when white Jewish people came to the East Coast, and how some of them were treated. We understand they were on the receiving end of bias. Yes, that did happen. However, after one generation, accent is gone, right? You can sort of blend in. You can just move to another city, change your name, you blend right in with the local white folks that were there, right? You could marry into. So yes, certain immigrants from certain European countries were on the receiving end of bias. I understand. Usually 1, possibly 2 generations, right? That they could do things just practically to acculturate or assimilate. Next, non-European immigrants and their descendants have also been the targets of racial bias in the U.S., including but not limited to Asian folks, Latinos, and Middle Eastern. So we get this. We understand many people in the U.S. have been on receiving end of bias at various points. Okay. Now, but with this, let me go back here. So with this, however, in providing this context, in the history of the U.S., in terms of social scientific study, the black-white sort of paradigm of race and racial attitudes has been the most studied. It's the most long-lasting, right? I should say long-lasting. Native Americans are already here as well. Those dynamics are looked at also. But it was the most extreme, I should say, and long-lasting form of bias in U.S. history. So it's been studied the most, hundreds, thousands of studies, that sort of thing. So that's going to be the emphasis as we push forward here as well. Racism. Here we go, folks. Let's go ahead and define this for you. Racism has been defined in several ways. There is no 100% consensus definition amongst all social scientists, but the following characteristics are common. Number 1. All right, so I'm going to give you sort of 3 definitions of racism. This is probably the most utilized and historic definition among social scientists. A system of advantage based on race, okay? This requires power. So system of advantage based on race. These are your macro level institutions, your national systems, right? So you think about this constitutionally and otherwise, that's that macro historical institutional level. Here's a way to think about this, okay? Be honest, thought experiment. What racial minority group could wake up tomorrow morning just because they decided to do so, could change the life outcomes of all white Americans in a meaningful way? What racial minority group, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, Indigenous, just because they wanted to, could change the life outcomes of white Americans in a meaningful way? Which one? You know which one? None of them. Why? Because to change the life outcomes of white Americans in a meaningful way requires power, right? It requires power. It requires systems, right? And racial minority requires power. And the notion is these racial minorities, don't really have that sort of power. So, so we talk about the criminal justice system, the government system, right? So when you talk about the systems of power, right? The presidency, governorship, state legislatures, Congress, that sort of thing, those things control systems. Racial minorities cannot control those systems, right? You ever somebody say racial minorities cannot be racist? Have you heard that? With this definition, that statement is true, right? Why? They can't be racist with this definition because they do not control systems at a macro institutional level. Yes, you could have one Supreme Court justice or even the president or even a senator, but to control systems, I'm not even talking about Fortune 500 companies, corporations, right? They don't control the levers of power, E-L-E-V-E-R-S, levers of power. Racial minorities do not control those levers of power, okay? Next definition. So with this definition, racial minorities cannot be racist. Okay, but there are other definitions. Next definition, the transformation of racial prejudice through the exercise of power against a racial group perceived as inferior. This also requires power. This is more intermediate. So this definition, say I'm the CEO of a company and my bias plays out. I'm a mayor, I'm a chief of police, those sorts of things. So I could be more local, not macro, not national, not institutional, right? But more local, I have some power and my biases can play out in a meaningful way. That can happen, okay? And then we have the most what we call individual beliefs, attitudes, institutional arrangements, and acts that tend to denigrate individuals or groups because of phenotypic, biological characteristics or ethnic group affiliation. Okay, it does not require power. It can be symbolic or aversive. So beliefs and attitudes. With this definition, anybody can be racist. Black person, white person, Hispanic person, Asian person. Why? Because I can believe that my historical group is superior to other racial groups. So I can believe as an individual that that is the case, and I can have bias, racial bias, as an individual. It's not systemic. I'm not controlling institutions, but it can have some impact. So as an individual, anybody can be racist, sexist, ageist, anti-Semitic, that sort of thing. Okay? Now, so we have that. So we're going to dig a bit deeper. Now, again, this can occur at the implicit or explicit levels. Implicit or explicit levels, okay? All right, now, we're going to talk about types of racism, which deals with more of the individual. So we're going to talk about symbolic racism. So these are, again, social scientific terms. I am a social psychologist. So I'll give you a citation you can look at and go a bit deeper, okay? Here we go. So symbolic racism, okay? Let me sort of move myself around a little bit here. The expression of prejudice in the form of opposition to policies or decisions that support minority groups. Think policy. Political policies people support, don't support, and the politicians that push certain policies. You think about that, right? Especially when we're in political seasons, it's going to be very interesting, very helpful. Okay. In the U.S., right, the verbal expression of explicit acts of old-fashioned or blatant racism decreased over the past 50 years. This is some background. So what happened was measures of old-fashioned racism could not predict people's actual position regarding racially targeted policies and black political candidates. Social scientists needed a new framework and measure. So people weren't willing to acknowledge, oh, I don't like those people because they're black, Hispanic, or whatever, or even gender bias. It wouldn't explicitly state it, okay? So we had to do something, social scientists. In the U.S., so we developed symbolic racism scales and measures. So in the U.S., symbolic racism is a combination of politically conservative, individualistic values and negative feelings towards blacks, Latinos, and other groups, right? So it plays out in a couple of different ways. Again, think about policy. People with high symbolic racism are not directly derogatory about other groups, but they express negative feelings indirectly, blaming them on some quality of the group, other groups. So for example, if black people will only try harder, they could be as well off as white people, that sort of thing. So you're not saying I don't like black people. You're just saying you're pointing out their deficits. What's wrong with them? If they only did this, if they only did that, it's on them, that sort of thing. Not acknowledging historical context, which I already explained to you. So it's this notion of put yourself up by your bootstraps and personal responsibility and all of that, without including the historical context that led to people being in certain conditions, okay? Also, symbolic racism will predict, in the U.S. context, a lot of research is done on racial attitudes of white Americans towards other groups, towards black Americans in particular. Symbolic racism predicts white people's attitudes towards a range of racially relevant policies, including busing, affirmative action, Social programs proceed to disproportionately benefit minority groups and support a racial minority political candidates. All right. So this is what the social science and political science have shown over time. Again, I'm not talking about every white person. I'm not saying all white people are racist. No, I'm giving you the patterns of data in the literature that social scientists have uncovered. So the symbolic notion. So it's not direct, but symbolically, my bias towards another group may be expressed. How my voting patterns, supporting certain policies, that sort of thing. So you hear people pushing certain policies. Ask yourself, who benefits from that policy and who does not? And then look at if there's a pattern of those who are advantaged or disadvantaged by a policy. And then you can sort of reverse engineer and see where certain biases may lie. Okay? All right. Let's keep on pushing. Other types of racism. Another type is aversive racism. Aversive racism. Now, on the flip side, check this out. Aversive racism, all right, simultaneously holding egalitarian or positive or fair values and negative feelings towards people of other races, Hispanics, blacks, that sort of thing. Okay. Now, folks who exhibit aversive racism believe in racial equality. They believe in racial equality and equal opportunity, but also feel uncomfortable around minorities and trying to avoid them when possible. So you see that? All right. So on the liberal side, we're going from conservative to the liberal side. So the liberal side, a liberal person may be woke and that sort of things, have to woke treat each other, but may still be uncomfortable in certain settings with other groups, right? I'm not saying all white woke people feel this way. Relax. I'm saying for a subset, they may believe in egalitarian values and that everybody's equal and we should just see each other as human beings and so forth, and still have racial bias. What does that look like? Well, it often involves microaggressions, such as sitting further away from certain people, less eye contact, or talking in a less friendly manner, or in conversation sooner. These are all microaggressions. People may not know, but they're small slights in a daily interactions. Now, in addition to this, it reflects the biases of people who are politically liberal, who genuinely believe that they are non-prejudiced, right? So I love my liberal brothers and sisters. I love my conservative brothers and sisters. I love humanity. But on both ends, right, biases can also play out, right? This is why social scientists have jobs, because no one is exempt, right? As a human being, your brain and society is going to function in a certain way. Your brain and society are going to interact in a way that's going to lead to certain biases. That's just what it is. Now, the more mature we can be about acknowledging that process, the more progress that we can make. So, again, on this aversive racism often involves implicit bias. For example, being more likely to hire an average white person than an average black candidate for a job, but giving non-racial reasons for doing so. See, again, as I said before, you've been took, had, bamboozled, led astray, run amok into thinking what? Oh, bias has to be extreme, egregious, awful but lawful, whatever the case is. No, it doesn't. Folks, bias is much more likely to happen when you have options that you can justify. What do I mean? It's one thing if a black person is super qualified, Hispanic person is super qualified, and people are like, oh, that person's so qualified, it's going to be amped up. They're going to be super excited about hiring that person, right? Minority person, very qualified, they're more qualified than everybody else. Wow, we like that. That's great. Okay. That's not where the bias is going to happen. Somebody who's super duper qualified, not getting a job. No. What's going to happen is you're going to have a black or Hispanic person and a white person, equally qualified, but at a moderate level. Say on a scale of 1 to 10, there are 7 average level qualifications. The science says both liberals and conservatives and everybody in between, right, who have this sort of aversive racism will lean, aversive or symbolic, but will lean towards the white candidate, right? They just will. That's what the science says. Equally qualified, but at a average or at an average sort of mid-level. That's where your bias comes in. Why? You can justify it. Oh, I mean, why do you hire a black person? Oh, because, I looked at their scores. I looked at how they interviewed. It's not going to be a race. It's not going to be a race-based explanation. It's going to be all these other explanations. But the science says with the conservative or liberal, the outcome will be similar. The path to the outcome can vary, but the outcome itself, still race-related, still racially biased, but through different paths, do you see? Okay? So the conservative side, through the policies, black people are fine, I like Hispanic folks. Oh, no, they're fine. But these policies, no, it will be unfair to do that. It'll be unfair to do that. Because those policies, right, to a certain extent, may benefit a certain group more so than the other. And there's something in there that says that's not right, that's not fair for that group to benefit. On the other side, these people equally qualified, but I lean towards one. I don't even know I'm leaning towards one. I could be a liberal person leaning towards one versus the other, just implicitly. Okay. So folks, hopefully this was helpful in terms of where these biases come from. We're going to go ahead and summarize now as we get ready to wrap up. Okay. So in summary, race is a social construct. We get that, but biological traits are related. Definition of race evolved over time, became associated with physical traits during European transatlantic slave trade. It served a functional and economic purposes. Those purposes. If you get that, it helps. Modern definitions of racism include systemic, local, and individual components. It involves extreme racial bias. So we can have a racial bias, right? Extreme forms we sort of see in that racism category, okay? Now again, different levels, right? Systemic, more intermediate, and individual. Historically, racial bias of whites towards blacks is most studied racial bias combination by social scientists in the U.S. As anti-black racial bias has and continues to be the strongest negative racial bias in the U.S. So that's implicit and explicit. Explicit hate crimes. Go to FBI data. I'll show this in another video. FBI data, look at hate crimes. Black folks on the receiving end of more hate crimes than any other group, by far, not even close. Okay? So explicit bias, receiving end, black folks. Implicit bias, science is pretty clear. Again, African Americans relative to any other group in the U.S., right? In terms of home loans, education, employment, income. Pick a category in the U.S., pick a sort of audit study, a scientific study, and it'll show that black Americans tend to fare the worst in many of these outcomes, implicitly, okay? So people say, why do you focus on race and why do you focus on, that's why, because the science tells me so. Folks, again, I acknowledge anyone can be on the receiving end of bias, depending on the situation, okay? Next, both conservative and liberals can display racial bias to varying degrees, okay? And finally, racial bias is not genetic, it's learned. There is no racism gene, okay? It doesn't kind of come with the package, it is learned, right? And so in our next sort of time together, part 2, we're going to look at this series, why are some people racist? We're going to look at 6 key causes of racism, right? In your genetics are not one of them, okay? So tune in. Again, we're trying to release these, weekly. Tuesday's the target day around 1:30. Give or take on special occasions that may be off a bit, but that is our target date and time. Again, folks, feel free to visit our website, www.national.training. We offer, again, virtual and in-person trainings. We're working on a self-paced video-based learning modules, a curriculum. So that's to come. For our current clients, former clients, good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Forward the links, the videos to your friends and so forth. And we appreciate you working with us historically and in the future. And with that, folks, peace and blessings. Have a great day.